As some of you may know, I originally come from the northwestern county of Lancashire in England. I am indeed a Lancashire lass. This is one of the counties that became synonymous with the cotton and wool spinning trades of the Industrial Revolution, and the place that was written of as having dark satanic mills. It is a truly beautiful county, very craggy. It has the most gorgeous forests, strange dark peaty moorlands, witchery hills, often a very dark leaden heavy sky, adding an air of mystery to pretty much anything. And being on the side of the Pennine Hills that it is, it rains a lot. But this makes for a very watery landscape full of rivers and babbling brooks. It's a rather underrated county for tourism visits, but get away from the main super slick cities such as Manchester or Liverpool, full of their mixture of Victorian splendour and bright lights and such. You will find a countryside full of historical and folklore gems. The folklore of Lancashire tends towards the dark, the ghostly and the ghastly. And I believe that this is because of the harsher landscape and the darker skies. However, the folklore is really interesting. We don't have so many pretty fairies up in Lancashire. We have wicked things and scary things and things that are a little more gothic in nature. Today, I am going to tell you about a darker fairy creature that seems to absolutely love the north of England, and Lancashire in particular, so it seems, the Boggart. Now, I lived in Manchester, Lancashire, as a child, not too far from a place called Boggart Hole, Clough. This was through the 1980s, and even then, people were still wary of the Boggart there. As kids, we knew to be really careful around the Clough. The Boggart could take small children at its worst, and at its best, it would turn milk sour or just be destructive. I was fascinated by this kind of thing as a child. You can tell I still am, and I am rather attracted to this darker folklore. Must be because of my Lancashire roots. So, without further ado, I present the solitary fairy creature known as the Boggart. It is believed that one aspect of the Boggart is a household helpful spirit that has gone bad, one that has been insulted by the household, given a name, or not given due respect and pay. Another aspect are those attached to a particular place in the countryside. Whichever the individual Boggart might be, the common theme seems to be attachment, and this can be a bit of a nightmare for those whose Boggarts are household ones, because you can't just leave and escape them. They seem to attach themselves to a family. In a way, some of them are almost like poltergeists in attitude and nature. The household Boggart, or those attached to farms, can be a real nuisance, especially if given a name, even if by accident. In this case, the destruction will become worse and worse until eventually the Boggart is uncontrollable. They will take things that are lying around, move things, curdle milk into sourness. For some reason they will turn on the family dogs so that these poor animals become lame. These creatures can even crawl into your very own bed at night, clamping their clammy large hands over the sleeper's face. They are known for stripping bed sheets off the sleeper. They will pull their ears, very poltergeist-like, very noisy. One way to protect your home from this absolute pest is to hang a horseshoe at the door. Another, particularly to stop bedtime mischief, is to place salt at the edge of your doorway. I still do this. Many people I know do. It is a tradition stretching back to who knows when, but salting doorways, I have always believed keeps evil spirits out of the house. I have 4 cats, 2 dogs, a rabbit and a small bird. We really don't need any more chaos in the house. Boggarts who live in nature are much more dangerous than house boggarts. It is these that are child abductors and persecutors of travellers at night, much more devilish. These are known to live in holes in the ground, around marshlands, under bridges, and at very sharp bends in the roads. These boggarts who can make themselves invisible would frighten horses into insanity, leaving them galloping wildly or bucking. Took boggarts, as the Lancashire folk used to say about horses in this distress. They would lead walkers into treacherous places where their lives were in danger. Poor travellers sometimes went missing in these cases, and the folk and the families would agree a boggart had caught them and eaten them. They were gone forever. Despite the care not to name boggarts and increase their power, there are recorded some named boggarts. One is Nutnan. She lived, and maybe still does, in Moston, on the outskirts of Manchester. She would fly and climb through hazelnut bushes that grew in one place there, emitting an ear-piercing scream. Another named boggart was called Owd Hob. This creature was said to be the master of all the boggarts of Lancashire. He had the appearance of a satyr, with horns, cloven hooves and a tail. Sounds familiar. Now, of course, Hob relates to 2 more folkloric topics. The hobgoblin, a helpful but shy household spirit, and Hob is also another name for the devil himself. There was a tradition that boggarts would capture and eat very small fairies. Owl pellets that were found lying around were thought by some to be the excreta of the boggarts, and the tiny bones found within them were the leftovers of the very small fairy victims. So, what do boggarts look like when they are not making themselves invisible? Well, there are various accounts of how they can shapeshift, and the descriptions of them are wide and varied, so maybe this is due to their shape-shifting abilities. Descriptions give them as rather human-like in shape, and yet with something not quite right about the features. More as though a beast has been fused with a human. One writer described a boggart he knew of as a squat, hairy man, strong as a 6-year-old horse, and with arms almost as long as tackle poles. Other folk have described them as completely beast-like, but still with something wrong about the beast's shape. For example, there was a Yorkshire boggart from a place called Longarheed that was as large as a calf. It had shaggy hair and enormous eyes as big as saucers. This also sounds like the black dog, the Barghest, trash shrike sightings that we get on Lancashire and Yorkshire moorlands, especially the huge eyes. This boggart had a huge chain that dragged along the floor behind it, giving out the most dreadful noise, the sound of baying hounds, howling dogs. Another boggart yet was said to look like a strange horse. As I said, their visages are wide and varied. There are many places around Lancashire and Yorkshire with boggart names, and other counties also that record boggarts in place names. Here are just a few that I have found. Near Clapham, in the incredibly beautiful Yorkshire Dales, on the Newby Moss moorlands, there are a group of potholes called the Boggarts' Roaring Holes. Folklore tales tell us that there was a family of flesh-hungry boggarts living there. Their growls can still be heard, coming from the dark depths of these deep, mysterious holes. Boggart Bridge in Burnley in Lancashire was a very dangerous place for those who needed to cross there. Tradition stated that the traveller must give a living thing as a sacrifice to the boggart that lived there, or it would take the traveller's soul instead. At Seacroft in Leeds, in West Yorkshire, there is a whole estate of council houses on a place called Boggart Hill, with roads called things like Boggart Drive, Boggart Hill Gardens, Boggart Hill. It would seem that the area must have been named for the fear of boggarts at that place, and hauntings have been recorded by some of those living on the housing estate to this day. Saddleworth Moor in Lancashire is a really haunting looking strange place, with black peaty soil, rust-coloured tussocks, very low granite grey clouds, strange rivulets of silvery water, and a complete atmosphere of haunted emptiness. There is a stand of rocks here called the Boggart Stones. And finally we come to my childhood Boggart neighbourhood, Boggart Hole Clough. The Clough is at the border of the Manchester towns of Moston and Blakely, a steep wooded gorge with fairy-like dells, very pretty, very Victorian in the modern parts, and just ever so slightly sinister when you get away from these places. It is a municipal park, so people can visit very easily, and it was always a place for the local children to go sledging in winter. The steep valleys, the cloughs in Lancashire dialect, are full of majestic old trees, and it is some of these valleys that are said to house the boggarts of the Clough. There is one tale I will tell you of the Boggart of Boggart Hole Clough, the most famously recorded of all. After all, folk don't usually record these things. It is usually kept as just local word-of-mouth knowledge, things to warn the kids about. But here is the tale of the Boggart, and its persecution of the farmers who lived there. In the days when Manchester had not spread its tendrils so far and wide, when the towns and villages around had not become so modern and so full of cars and houses, shops and human chaos, Blakely was a small village, close by a beautiful and enchanting dell, secluded and alone, and with a strange name, Boggart Hole. Roby, who collected this story from the locals, found it a delightful place, describing it as steep-sided, a clough surrounded by hazel and beech trees, full of ferns and wild plants. At the bottom of this, and after a cautious climb down grasping trees and boulders, he found himself on a patch of rich greenery, beautiful, but haunted and strange. To one side of this green space he saw a dark corner. A mossy stone created an overhang, and a deep dark cave was beneath, the home of the Boggart of the Clough. He had been told a most unusual tale of this fiend, and how it terrorized a local farming family, told by an old lady of the area who knew it all so well. About 2 fields distant from the Clough was an old farm, a serene-looking place by day, shaded by a great sycamore tree. This was the farm that had once belonged to George Cheetham, an honest man, hard-working as all farmers are. By night, however, this place became a house of dread, because the Boggart had chosen this farm for his playground, and those poor souls who lived there as his playthings. The maids were terrified, the workmen worried out of their wits, the children frightened beyond fear. It was said that not even a mouse would dare enter that house after the clock struck 12. For many years they had become used to a strange company on winter nights at the farm. As merry tales were told around the fire and the laughter rang out, a strange noise would join them, small, shrill, a laugh like the toy trumpet a child would have as a toy. The youngest of the farmer's sons, Robert, on hearing this strange noise as part of the laughter one dark evening, just before Christmas, acknowledged the invisible guest. I won't do the next bit in the Lancashire dialect, as you would never understand a word, but this is what he said in my own annotation. Robert spoke to the empty air. "Well laughed, Boggart. You are a fine little tyke, I'm betting, if one of us could just catch one glimpse of you." Now, anyone who knows the nature of hobgoblins and house goblins will know that these creatures detest having notice made of them. They will not stand for it at all. It does something to them. It turns them bad. They had become so used to their invisible guest at the farm that they had forgotten this. On that night, more and more stories were told, pleasant tales in front of a roaring warm hearth, more stories on that one night than had ever been heard in all the 3 months before together. All the farm family and workers around that hearth that night were full of happiness, full of mirth and comfort. Surely even a Boggart would make himself comfortable there. And yet, that small, shrill laugh was heard no more around the fireside after Robert's words. Robert was a short, stout young man for his age, and he slept in the same bed as his older brother John, a common thing in the days of not enough room and not enough beds. John, opposite to his brother in stature, was tall and considered very fine for his years. They had no sooner gotten into bed to rest and were falling asleep than a small shrill voice was heard in their room. "Little tyke indeed, little tyke yourself. Ho ho ho, I'll have my laugh now, ho ho ho." The room was completely dark, and the house was so still that this sound from nowhere terrified them. A screeching laughter then followed, echoing around the room. Next, young Robert was seized by his feet and pulled to the bottom of the bed, then dragged back up to his pillow. Again this was repeated, down to the bottom of the bed, back to the pillow, where his taller brother was lying terrified. And in between each pull, the now recognised voice of the Boggart screeched, "Short and long won't match, short and long won't match, ho ho ho." This pulling and screeching went on for what seemed like 100 times, and yet the brothers were so terrified that they neither dared leave the bed. On and on went the persecution of Robert and John, who forever after this time was known locally as Long John. At last the cold grey light of morning crept through the window. Breathing a sigh of relief, the exhausted John rolled to his side, straightened and pulled the blankets over himself, and said to his brother Robert, "Maybe we'll now have some rest, perhaps." But that same voice came from the ether. "Rest? What is rest? Boggart knows no rest." In the full of the morning, the brothers rushed to tell their father what had happened. "The plague take you for a Boggart," he was said to have shouted into the air. "Plague take you, can you not let the poor things be quiet?" And with this he told all who would listen, including the Boggart, that it could sleep in his son's room that night on its own, and challenged the Boggart. His sons now would sleep over the cart house, and the Boggart could get up to its tricks on his own. The boys' bed was moved to their new room above the cart house, and at last they had some peace. However, the farmer had knowingly given a room to the Boggart in the farm. It had increased its power, and with this, it was no longer a random visitor, but invited, and could lord it over the household as a member of the farm. Familiarity, they say, breeds contempt. And now the children's bread and butter would be snatched away. Bowls of bread and milk would be thrown to the floor by an unseen hand, or, if the younger ones were left alone but for a few minutes, they were sure to be found screaming with terror on the return of their nursemaid and parents. Sometimes, however, the Boggart behaved himself kindly, in the manner of a household spirit or hobgoblin. The cream was found churned, and pans and kettles found scoured and clean. There was one circumstance that happened that was very peculiar. The stairs in the farm rose from the kitchen, and a partition of boards covered the end of the steps at the edges, making a closet beneath the stairway. From one of the boards of this partition, a large round knot in the wood was accidentally knocked out, and one day the youngest of the children, while playing with a shoehorn, stuck it into this knot hole. It was not known who had removed this knot in the wood, whether it was an accident or on purpose by the Boggart, so that it could spy on the family, using it as a peephole. However, it had happened that shoehorn was ejected with such force and such precision that it would hit the head of whoever had poked it in there in the first place, and in this case it shot out and struck the little child over its ear. Whether this was done by the Boggart in sport, or in anger, or sheer malice, they just did not know. At first, the family were furious about this harm to their child. Naturally, it is the first reaction to anyone or anything that would dare to harm the beloved child in a family, regardless of what paranormal creature had caused the injury. Over time, however, and on repetition of the shoehorn being placed in the hole and then flung out at the protagonist, the family became used to this trick of the Boggart, and it became almost an amusing game, to the point where they began to call it "laking with Boggart" or "playing with the Boggart." An old travelling tailor and his apprentice were often hit on the head by the shoehorn when they visited the farm for their work there, and while they were sitting at the kitchen table. It would seem, though, that the Boggart became bored with this game and its familiarity. It went back to persecuting the family at night. The traditional dress in Lancashire up to quite late in the mid-1900s, and still worn as a fashion item today, is the Lancashire clog. This is a wooden shoe with a leather upper and all held together with little metal nails. Sometimes underneath the front of the toe there is a little metal bar. You can imagine the clatter these make, especially on wooden floorboards. Well, this familiar sound now filled the household, up and down the stairs, stomping in the dead of darkness. Pewter and crockery dishes were thrown to the floor. Great clatter, a great noise, and yet, in the morning when the family would creep downstairs to clean the damage, absolutely nothing had been moved from the shelves at all. The main victims of the Boggart were the children of the farm. Their bed curtains were pulled together to keep the warmth in, and these would be pulled first one way and then the other, and then a human-like weight would press down upon them into the mattress, almost suffocating their little bodies. They just could not escape. The whole house would be filled with noises of the Boggart and the screams of the family all night, and night after night after night. The farmer and his wife decided they could not take it any longer. They had to get out of the farm as quickly as they could for the sake of their health and the sake of their family. They loaded their belongings as much as they could carry into wagons and took to the road. George Cheetham and his wife were in the cart, following with all their worldly possessions that they had with them, when they met on the road another farmer, a neighbour called John Marshall. "So, Georgie, you are finally leaving the farm," John Marshall said to George. "I'm forced to, as you can see," said George. "That weariful Boggart torments us so much we can neither rest night nor day because of it. It seems to have malice against the young ones, and my poor wife here is almost dead for thinking about it, and so we are forced to flee like." He had only got this far in his conversation with John Marshall when a small, shrill, and worryingly familiar voice came from inside a milk churn that was balanced highest on top of all this cart's load. Aye, neighbour," said the voice. "We're fleeing, as you can see." "Oh, rot you," exclaimed George. "If I had known that you would be fleeing too, I wouldn't have bothered." "No, it's no use, Mally," he said, turning to his wife. "We may as well turn back to the old house to be tormented there, rather than in another not so convenient." And this they did. They returned to the farm with all their things and all their family. However, the Boggart, realising that he had almost lost its very comfortable home, became rather less of a nuisance after this time, and was very careful not to disturb the family after that too much. So there it is, the reason that Boggart Hole Clough and Boggarts have such a bad reputation. Honestly, the nature ones sound incredibly wild, feral and dangerous. The household ones sound like a real pain, which, although not dangerous, I can imagine would really wear you down over time. And there are sightings to this day of strange-looking creatures in the Clough, too many to be ignored, and usually of a very familiar human beast-like entity. Interesting and thought-provoking indeed. Seems if you hear a small, shrill laugh in your house, for heaven's sake, don't even mention it. Just leave the thing be. Ignore it. Thank you for listening to this latest episode. If you enjoyed it, please click like, and please do consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you to those that already have. It's very much appreciated. See you next time for another peculiar tale. But until then, dear friends, keep well, brightest of blessings, and remember, don't play with the fairy folk, or you may end up in one of my folk tales yourself.